Hi, everyone. I hope you are having a good week so far. Um, I wanted to just give you a few updates about the class and then give you a little bit more of a lecture slash explanation of some of the main themes in Arendt's reading. A few things about the class itself. One, you have a quiz today that will be available for 24 hours. It'll be available at noon starting today, and then you will have 24 hours to complete it. You have a discussion post due by Sunday of this week. Please complete that. Um, Regarding the quizzes, you'll have one more next week on Arendt, and then one more discussion post next week. And then the final week of class, which is the week after next, there will be no discussion posts and no quizzes. The only thing you'll need to worry about going into that final week is making sure you get that second paper done by Sunday, April 26th. I have it as being 3 to 5 pages as opposed to the longer length of 5 to 7 pages. So it's only 3 to 5 pages. Um, in terms of the final exam, my sense is now that Clemson has instituted the pass-fail policy, many of you may have decided, or many of you may decide that you have no interest in taking a final exam, regardless of where your grade stands, because of the pass-fail option. However, if you do want to take a final exam, and that is something you're interested in, I would like you to start thinking about that now and to notify me as soon as possible. One other quick note, if you're in group 3, you have an analysis due by Friday, and then that's it. No more analyses either. So I already made that announcement Monday. But in terms of class updates, that's about it. Also, as I'm looking here in the camera, I hope you have all gotten to appreciate my cowlick that shows up here every time I'm on this video. I cannot get it to go down, and I hope that those of you with frustrating hair can relate to me. This will never go down. And who knows, given how long this quarantine lasts, I may not be able to get a haircut for a while, and the cowlick will only get worse. So you can continue to monitor the status of my cowlick on my head. Um, Anyways, I hope that made you laugh a little bit. Let's move into Arendt. So I talked on Monday about the sort of the introductory context to Arendt's reading, and today's reading kind of really gets into her distinction, not necessarily between conscientious objection and civil disobedience, although that is the big distinction that Arendt is making. She's concerned about the extent to which conscientious, or that the extent to which civil disobedience gets conflated with conscientious objection, which is to say, thinking of the civil disobedient as simply someone who justifies his or her action on moral grounds as opposed to political grounds. And that's really the distinction I want to get into today. Is Arendt is making a pretty hard and fast distinction between morality and politics. And I want to see if I can if I can explain to you why she wants to make that distinction, and see, maybe where you find yourself coming down, whether you agree with Arendt's sort of distinction between morality and politics, and to understand why she's making it. Because what's at stake here is trying to defend civil disobedience, and she doesn't think that only a moral justification for civil disobedience will get us to understanding the true nature of what civil disobedience is. So that's what's at stake here. It's trying to clarify what civil disobedience is. And so let's go ahead and take a look at what she has to say. So she begins today's readings, and this really gets into the meat of what she's going to start saying. On page 58, she immediately starts by reflecting on Thoreau and Socrates. And again, she calls the images of Thoreau and Socrates. And the reason she keeps going back to them is because for a lot for a lot of us in the Western tradition, Western literature, Western philosophy, Western culture, we take Thoreau and Socrates to be the those sort of, they're kind of like paradigmatic figures um, of those who engaged in civil disobedience. Socrates breaking the laws of Athens, and Thoreau breaking the laws in Massachusetts and going to jail. And I said on Monday why those images are so popular, and indeed they to some extent still are. Now, Martin Luther King may also be, and he kind of straddles the line between conscientious objection and civil disobedience, and we'll think more about that in a second. But she opens today's reading by saying, the images of Socrates and Thoreau occur not only in the literature on our subject, but also, and more importantly, in the minds of the civil disobedience themselves. And indeed, if you remember in MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, he specifically references Socrates. He says he is taking himself to be continuing in the tradition of the gadfly, those who caused tension in society. So there's evidence for Arendt's claim here is that King references Socrates himself. To those who were brought up in the Western tradition of conscience, it seems only natural to think of their agreement with others as secondary to a solitary decision, as though what they had in common with others was not an opinion or judgment, but a common conscience. And since the arguments used to buttress this position are usually suggested by more or less vague reminiscences of what Socrates and Thoreau had to say about the citizen's moral relation to the law, it may be best to begin these considerations with a brief examination of what these two actually had to say. So Arendt is going to go to their text. She's going to go to the Credo and the Apology, and she's going to go to Thoreau's civil disobedience essay, and to see what they actually said. And Arendt thinks that by going to those texts, she's actually going to find out that they themselves, again, were only concerned with conscience, their individual conscience, satisfying that, rather than necessarily worrying about the larger public significance, the larger public injustice that was going on as a result of the things they were protesting against. And so that's what I want to think about. So again, I just want to look at the actual writing that Arendt is engaged in here. She's engaged in a kind of textual analysis of Socrates' Credo and Apology, and then Thoreau's civil disobedience essay. And she just wants to look at what they themselves said in their own words, and how they were justifying their actions, to try to show some of the limitations of what they were interested in, right? So she says, an unexamined life is not worth living. That is, a personal life. My own life is not worth living if it is unexamined. He owed it to himself as well as the citizens he had addressed to stay and die. It is the payment of a debt of honor, the payment of a gentleman who has lost a wager and who pays because he cannot otherwise live with himself. So again, the evidence seemed to suggest that Socrates is talking about his ability to live with himself. That is crucial for what Arendt's going to say about morality, is that morality and conscience are a personal matter, that I, what standards do I hold myself to? Not necessarily what do I hold others to, but what standards do I hold myself to? Then she looks at Thoreau, and she says, well, maybe Thoreau seems to provide us with a better model for civil disobedience. But she quotes Thoreau, and Thoreau says, it is not a man's duty as a matter of course to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty at least to wash his hands of it, and if he gives no thought longer, not practically to give it his support. Thoreau did not pretend that a man's washing his hands of it would make the world a better place, or that a man had any obligation to do so. He, quote, and then she continues, he, quote, came into this world not chiefly to make this a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. And so, again, and then she goes on to quote him at the bottom, really, for only if this is the case, then, quote, I say, break the law. And Thoreau was right. Individual conscience requires nothing more. So, again, she just wants to look at these texts. She wants to say, look, we take Thoreau and Socrates to be these paradigm instances of civil disobedience, but what we actually realize when we look at their texts is that they spoke largely in terms of themselves, and that there was no larger obligation to necessarily make society better or to change the laws. That as long as they were content with themselves, that they could live with themselves, that their conscience was satisfied, then then they were fine with what they did. That they were okay with it. That the world did not need to be made a better place as a result of their actions, as long as they themselves could be content with their actions and live with themselves. And so she thinks that that reveals something. That reveals something about it reveals something about uh, civil disobedience and conscientious objection, and the fundamental difference between them is that civil disobedience, at least in the vein of Martin Luther King, clearly King would not have been content to kind of just go to jail and be content with himself like Socrates and Thoreau. King, of course, demanded on the public nature of civil disobedience in order to make society a better place for future generations and to make the world a better place that he was living in right then. So again, we take Socrates and Thoreau, but then we actually look at what they have to say, and it seems as though they don't square with what our intuitions about what civil disobedience actually is. And so she's already kind of saying there's already some indication that these should not be our paradigms or our exemplars for what civil disobedience should be. So then I want to look, though, more specifically at what she says here. At the bottom, so at the bottom of 60, and this is Arendt's own sort of philosophy coming in here. She says, here as elsewhere, conscience is unpolitical. It is not primarily interested in the world where the wrong is committed or in the consequences that the wrong will have for the future course of the world. Conscience is unpolitical. What is she saying there? Well, it's helpful to understand Arendt's own political philosophy a little bit. For Arendt, if we are engaged in politics, and here it's important to understand that engaging in politics here is different. You'd have to read more of Arendt to really get a true sense of what she means by politics. But for Arendt, politics, we have to kind of bracket our intuitions about what we sort of unreflectively take to be the meaning of politics. Politics for Arendt is necessarily public action engaged in by a group of individuals. Politics does not have anything necessarily to do with participating in the formal kind of institutional mechanisms of politics. So something like voting or running for office or anything having to do with, politicians and elections and government, that we don't necessarily have to think of that as the meaning of politics for Arendt. For politics, Arendt has an existential meaning. It is a domain of our lives that is fundamental to our experience that we need to engage in. So, for example, in another text, Arendt talks about the fact that politics has to do with the condition of human experience that has to do with plurality. And plurality for Arendt is a fundamental existential condition of our existence that has to do with the fact that, as Arendt states, that it's not man that inhabits the world. So lots of philosophers talk about man as inhabiting the world. It's men that inhabit the world, not man. And so politics has fundamentally to do with plural, men in the plural, as fundamentally distinct creatures who are fundamentally different than one another and who experience the world fundamentally differently than each other. And so politics has to do fundamentally with navigating a world in which all of us see it and experience it differently. That is what politics is, always comes back to this condition of plurality for Arendt. And so when she says conscience is unpolitical, because conscience is only concerned with myself, with the fact that I am satisfied that when I go to bed at night, I don't have I'm not keeping myself up at night by the thoughts of what I did wrong that day, but yet I can sleep well at night. Similarly, Socrates and Thoreau could die knowing that they were at peace with themselves, that the parts of them were not out of line with each other. And so politics then, because it, again, going back to plurality, because politics is so fundamentally tied up in our existence with others as distinct creatures who experience the world together but differently, there's no sense in which conscience gets us at that kind of experience of the world we share together. Conscience only takes place in the dialogue in my head between me and myself. And so when she says conscience is unpolitical, that's what she means. Not primarily interested in the world. So the point is, I can go to bed at night and sleep just fine as long as I know I did the right thing. If injustice continues to happen out in the world, yes, that may bother me, but largely, as long as my conscience is satisfied, then everything's okay. I am at peace with myself. And so that's what she means when she says conscience is unpolitical. Politics fundamentally for Arendt has to do with, she defines politics as care for the world. And the world for Arendt, it's a technical term, but the world is the space that we share together. And politics always has to do with improving, or at least engaging in that shared space together. And in that sense, conscience, conscientious objection can never get us at the experience of politics, because it isn't about the world, it's about myself. And so that's the fundamental distinction. And so that's a crucial distinction that Arendt makes. So Arendt will continue in today's essay talking about how there is a history in political philosophy itself, talking about the distinction between the good man and the good citizen, which is to say, between morality and politics itself, thinking about whether or not, in order to be a good citizen, for example, do you need to be a good man? Do you need to be a moral person to engage in politics? And of course, if you think about, well, some of what we've read this semester, of course, you know, if you think about somebody like Hobbes, who has a pretty bleak view about the nature of morality, and that morality only comes into being with the creation of the state, and that there is no kind of pre-existing moral code. Similarly, Machiavelli, who people often reference as a kind of paradigm example of what a politician is, the kind of cunning, sly politician who kind of does whatever he can to get ahead. Machiavelli certainly did not regard morality as important for politics. And so we have, in our own history of political thought, we have instances in which we regard morality as not all that important for politics. Now, it's not to say every political thinker thought of it that way, but she wrote this possible conflict, so I'm at the bottom of 61, between the good man and the good citizen, between the individual self, with or without belief in an afterlife, and the member of the community, or as we would say today, between morality and politics is very old, older even than the word conscience, which in its present connotation is of relatively recent origin. And so Arendt is here, look, again, saying that the distinction when she's thinking about this distinction between, she's thinking about the distinction between conscientious objection and civil disobedience. But what kind of is presupposed in that distinction is a distinction between morality and politics. That's the sort of larger distinction that's kind of being presupposed by this distinction between civil disobedience and conscientious objection. So again, she goes on to quote Thoreau here, and Thoreau seemed to recognize that that he had no obligation as a citizen to make the world better, as long as he was content with himself. So she quotes him here. She says, Thoreau was consistent enough to recognize and admit that he was open to the charge of irresponsibility, the oldest charge against, quote, the good man. He said explicitly that he was not responsible for the successful working of the machinery of society, that he was not, quote, the son of the engineer, which is usually invoked rhetorically against the defenders of absolute justice, often for the purpose of excusing wrongs and crimes, neatly expresses the gist of the dilemma, right? So, um, so again, she's just sort of again looking at what Thoreau has to say here and how Thoreau himself seems to be aware of this distinction between morality and politics, and that and that you know we don't need to be good. Uh, we don't need to be good men in order to be good citizens, and vice versa. We can also be good men without being good citizens. And so she thinks that distinction has a long history in political thought, and indeed it's informing her own distinction here that she wants to make between morality and politics. I want to look at just a few more things that she has to say about. So on page 63, she goes on to talk about the fact. So. Uh, so on page 63, she's referencing another dialogue by Plato called the Gorgias, and she says, in the Gorgias, Socrates does not address the citizens as he does in the Apology, and in support of the Apology in the Crito. Here, Plato lets Socrates speak as the philosopher who has discovered that men have intercourse not only with their fellow men, but also with themselves, and that the latter form of intercourse, my being with and by myself, prescribes certain rules for the former. These are the rules of conscience, and they are like those of Thoreau that announced in his essay, entirely negative. They do not say what to do, they say what not to do. They do not spell out certain principles for taking action, they lay down boundaries no act should transgress. So again, this is another crucial feature of conscience for Arendt, is that conscience tells us what not to do. It prohibits us from doing things. It's the voice that kind of comes to the fore when we're about to do something and says, don't do this, it's bad. You shouldn't go forward with this action. So when she says they're entirely negative, it means they prescribe rules against doing things. And again, for Arendt, politics has to do with taking action, with improving the world, acting with other men. And so conscience will never tell us to act in certain ways. Conscience will only tell us not to act in certain ways. And so that's another sense in which conscience is unpolitical. It's unpolitical in the sense that it's only concerned with me, and it's unpolitical in the sense that it only tells us what not to do. So there are two senses in which conscience is unpolitical. That's a crucial sort of another crucial moment that Socrates, that she, by turning to Socrates and Thoreau, she thinks this is what she's discovering. So I just want to look a little bit more at some of what she says in today's reading. There's more to say, but one of the things she's going to end up saying is that conscience. So on, so again, 64, she says, hence the rules of conscience hinge on interest in the self. They say, be aware of doing something you will not be able to live with. It is the same argument that led to Camus' quote, stress on the necessity of resistance to injustice for the resisting individual's own health and well-being. So again, I don't want to act and fight against the law publicly and break laws because I'd be concerned about my own well-being. I don't want something personally to happen to me. And so that's what conscience is saying. The political and legal trouble with such justification is twofold. First, it cannot be generalized. In order to keep its validity, it must remain subjective. So I can't generalize the rules that I prescribe to myself to everyone else. I can't say everyone don't do this because conscience, it's personal to me. It's the dialogue between me and myself. And so again, what she says is, what I cannot live with may not bother another man's conscience. The result is that conscience will stand against conscience. And so this is another sort of element of this, is that simply because I can't live with something doesn't mean I can expect others to agree with me. And so if we rely on conscience as the justification for civil disobedience, we run into the problem of trying to figure out whose morality gets to count. Whose morality are we using to justify the civil disobedience? And Arendt's point is, when she says that conscience will stand against conscience, then, well, we just have a bunch of individual consciences butting heads, saying, well, no, I think this law is wrong based on my conscience, and I think this law is wrong based on my conscience. And then we don't know really whose cause or morality is the one we ought to be using as the standard to justify the action. Because, again, conscience is concerned with me, not with the world. And so, anyways, I feel like, I really have been getting into this, a lot here. And I think you get a sense, you get a sense of how stark this distinction between morality and politics is for Arendt, and why she wants to kind of make this distinction between civil disobedience and conscientious objection. She wants to say, what Arendt is going to go on to say is that civil disobedience must be public in nature, and that it must depend on shared common opinion. Which is to say for Arendt that politics is about needing to see the world from other people's perspectives and getting other people to share not only my perspective, but also I need to share other people's perspective. Politics, to form a political opinion for Arendt, is to see the world from other people's perspective. It's to inhabit somebody else's perspective. And again, this gets back to plurality, that politics has to be about plurality. It has to be about a shared opinion about the world that will engage the action. And if we go from a moral perspective, it's going to be really hard to get a shared world, a shared common opinion that will allow us to engage and improve the world together. So civil disobedience requires the work of getting others to share our opinions. That's what politics is about. It can't simply be about the dialogue between me and myself. And so always coming back to that condition of plurality for Arendt is important to understanding why civil disobedience must be political in nature and not moral in nature. So I want to look at how she ends today's reading. Now she does say, then this is important, she writes towards the end of today's reading, she writes, I'm at the bottom of 67 here, no doubt even this kind of conscientious objection can become politically significant when a number of consciences happen to coincide, and the conscientious objectors decide to enter the marketplace and make their voices heard in public. But then we are no dealing with the individuals or with a phenomenon whose criteria can be derived from Socrates or Thoreau. In the marketplace, the fate of conscience is not much different from the fate of the philosopher's truth. It becomes an opinion, indistinguishable from other opinions, and the strength of opinion does not depend on conscience, but on the number of those with whom it is associated. Right? So that's a crucial distinction there. That's when she's getting into the distinction. Once you decide to make your conscience public and enter the marketplace with other individuals to try and change the law, to protest the law, to make the world better, you fundamentally take what was a moral phenomenon and you make it political. Once you decide to enter the world and improve the world with others, it's no longer an individual dialogue between you and yourself. Now you have exposed your moral position and you have made it a political opinion. And now the point is you have to try to get others to agree with you, to get them on your side, to help you fight against the injustice that you perceive in the world. And therefore, no longer will it be enough simply to claim that you have some kind of moral high ground. Because you can't assume that just everyone in politics is just going to jump on your side because you have some kind of obvious moral high ground. Go back to the distinction I made before. Yes, it seems obvious that the laws that King was protesting against were racist. But what about a group of abortion protesters who stand in front of the entrance to an abortion clinic and deny entrance to women who are seeking abortions? They are also claiming that they have the moral high ground. And so you have this position of conscience against conscience. And the question is, how is it that you're engaging with the larger public and getting people on your side? It can't simply be about my moral high ground is higher than your moral high ground. Because how do we determine that? How do we figure that out? Politics for Arendt is not about a set of competing moral claims about who has the higher moral high ground and who has the lower one. That is not what politics is about. Politics is about opinion. An opinion for Arendt has to do with seeing the world from somebody else's perspective, right? I'm saying a lot here. There's a lot going on, but I hope all of this makes sense. And this is getting a little bit long, so that's all I'm going to say for now. I hope you're all doing well, and please email me if you have any questions.